If you had a Nintendo Entertainment System back in the day and you didn't get yourself a Sega Genesis or TurboGrafx 16, well then you probably waited for this, a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which is considered by many to be one of the greatest systems of all time. Now the Super Nintendo was released in 1991 in North America, 2 years later than the Genesis. And the Super Nintendo has a strange, very strange design, as we can see. It looks just like a toaster with its purple switches here and the eject lever. Now when you turn the power on, it actually locks the game in place, which Genesis didn't do. Now in my opinion, I actually prefer the Genesis by far better than the Super Nintendo. I mean, the European version of the Super Nintendo looked much slicker and much more appealing to the eye than its North American version. But as they say, it's not what matters on the outside, it's what matters on the inside. And on the inside, this is a powerhouse of 16-bit gaming. Well, just like every Nintendo console, it has its many exclusive games, such as F-Zero, Mario Kart, Super Mario World, Killer Instinct, and also it has a lot of exclusive Disney games made by Capcom, such as Magical Quest, Aladdin, and so on. Now the cartridges had about two designs. You had a design like this, and a design like this, which that's where the locking system goes. As soon as you turn the power in the system, it locks the cartridge in place, so you couldn't take it out when the power is on. Only when you turn the power off, you can take the cartridge out. Now the Super Nintendo, from having exclusive games, also had a lot of games that were also available on the Genesis. And some of the games were a little better on the Genesis, and some of the games were a little better on the Super Nintendo. Like such as, you know, if you compare Stargate or Judge Dredd or Demolition Man or Bubsy games and so on, they were better and much superior with the sound and graphics on the Super Nintendo. As for Genesis, such as games like RoboCop vs. Terminator, WrestleMania, Shaq Fu, and a couple others were actually much better on the Genesis because they were more closer to the arcades, such as like RoboCop vs. Terminator. Now the Super Nintendo, since it was released 2 years later than the Genesis, had a much better sound chip in it, which was made by Sony. And you know, Genesis sound chip was made by, I believe, Yamaha. And as we all know, Sony always makes, you know, outstanding top-notch products, and no exception here. Same thing. You know, the Super Nintendo sound chip that was made by Sony is just outshines the Genesis in every way. Even though that, you know, some programmers found a way to work around the Genesis sound and squeeze some amazing music. Now the Super Nintendo controller looks like this. It kind of resembles a dog bone in a way. It has its left and right trigger buttons, D-pad, which actually I'm not a big fan of this D-pad, because after playing for a couple hours, actually the edges of the D-pad starts to wear on your thumb, and actually, you know, it hurts after a couple hours of playing it, especially like games like Street Fighter and so on. When you're rapidly hitting the D-pad, it starts to wear on your thumb after a while. Now here's the select button, and the start button, which are the rubberized, yeah, they made it out of rubber. We got X, Y, X, B, A buttons right here. Now the European version of this controller had actually different pattern color scheme. It had like, I believe, blue, yellow, green, and red buttons. Whereas in US we only got two colors, like light blue and I guess purple. Other than that, that's the controller. What I like about this is actually, unlike Genesis controllers, this is actually made in Japan, and it's pretty comfortable. I would say pretty comfortable controller overall. Now, the Super Nintendo uses a controller plug like this, and here we have Nintendo. That's how it looks. Now, as I said before, I'm not a big fan of the North American version of Super Nintendo. The design of it is very, very odd. It looks like a toaster. Now, here we have the power switch on and off. Here we have the reset, I guess, lever or a switch. It's not really a switch, right? And here we have the inject lever. Now, when we put the cartridge goes in here, now when we put the game and we turn the power on, it actually locks the game in place, so you wouldn't be able to take it out when the console is powered on. Only when you power it off, that's when we can remove the game, which is very smart. The Sega Genesis didn't have this. I think it's very clever and very good precaution measurements. Now here we have two controller ports, a red LED, which is turns on when the system is on, indicating whether it's on or off. Now in the back we got 1-800 number. I guess if you're having problems of setting it up, or if you need maintenance or service, or say if your Super Nintendo broke, you call there and I guess they will tell you what to do. Here we have an AC adapter, which uses 10 volts, 850 milliamps. Here's this channel select, RF output. Here we got a multi AV out, which also supports S-video. Now this cable actually, same cable was used for GameCube or the N64, so it's very convenient if you have, you know, any of those systems. You could use their cables, you know, to run the system in a AV with the stereo sound. Now in the bottom, on the bottom of the system, we have a Super Nintendo, Super NES control deck. Tells you the model number, made in Japan, tells you what kind of AC adapter it uses, and it says only use the AC adapter model SNS002. Now right here we have an extension port. This was made actually for a CD add-on drive the Super Nintendo was going to use. Same concept as the Sega CD, and which unfortunately never came out because, you know, as we all know, Sony was supposed to make the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, and at the Electronic Consumer Show, when Sony announced that they were working with Nintendo to make a CD add-on, after that the Nintendo came out and stated that Sony is totally crazy, and, you know, they're actually working with Philips and so on. And we all know what came out of that, the PlayStation, and same thing happened with Philips. Eventually Nintendo canceled it and the CDI came out. So the CD add-on was actually never released for this system. So there's actually no reason for you know, this extension, because it's never been used or gonna be used. Now another really cool thing Super Nintendo is this device right here. This is a Super Game Boy, which goes into the cartridge slot onto your Super Nintendo like this, And what it does, it allows you to play Game Boy games in color on your Super Nintendo, on your TV, using Super Nintendo controller. Now, as we all know, the Game Boy had no color at all, it was just green and black. Now, when you put the game in, not that only runs it in stereo sound, it also runs it in color. I mean, the color palette is about, I think, 8 colors or so, maybe 16, I'm not really sure. So there is, kind of a, it's kind of a washed out color, but there's still somewhat colorful picture, I guess, which is still better than just playing it on a Game Boy. So if you did have a Game Boy and Super Nintendo and you put this converter, you could play, the Game Boy games at home. Oh, let's see. It looks like this. We got the label Super Game Boy on the bottom. Nothing really special. It kind of looks just like, a little bit bigger than your typical Nintendo cart. And the Super Nintendo is a great console to collect for. There's tons of games, amazing games that are released for it. And even though, some of the games still hold their value, a lot of, Nintendo games tend to do that, especially Mario games, or such as like Killer Instinct, or some exclusive like Super Metroid. But this system has a lot of great games for it, and fairly easy to collect for. I mean, they have a lot of stuff on it on eBay that you can, negotiate for a reasonable price, and so on. I never actually owned a Super Nintendo back in the day because I already had this, my beautiful Mega Drive. So I never really got into it. I mean, I played it at my friend's house a couple times, and to tell you the truth, there wasn't much of a difference. So if you already had the Sega Genesis, there was no reason to go out and buy a Super Nintendo. So when the Genesis came out, I already made a switch, and I became a Genesis loyal customer. So I never actually had a Super Nintendo until about, I would say, 96. So, I got into it really late, and it was really good because at that time, it didn't really cost a whole lot of money to get one of these. So what I did, I snatched it up. For a reasonable price, you can't beat it. So if you're looking to buy one of these, you should be able to get one between $20 to $50 range, depending on how many games and what comes with it, in places such as eBay, or you can get it at the retro video game shops. I personally think the 16-bit generation, was the best of all time. For me, the 16-bit games, the fantastic 2D games that were created back in the day, they have that spark that the new games unfortunately lack in that kind of sense. And it's just such a fantastic video game system. And I would recommend, if you do get one of these, to get Donkey Kong series, Super Metroid, or the Mario games. The games are very long. It will take you a long time, to play and explore, and it's just really fun. So thank you for viewing my video.